Welcome. I'm Fred Murphy from the Marxist Education Project, or the MEP, as we like to call it. We are extremely happy that so many of you are joining us for this reading group, Blood and Money from Primitive Accumulation to Racial Capitalism. As of now, we have about 115 registered participants, which makes this the largest reading group we have ever hosted. And as you can imagine, it presents some challenges, which we're going to address later on today after the introductory presentation by our guest, David McNally. The publication of David's book, Blood and Money, last year came at an important political moment for all of us. It has enabled the MEP to continue our mission of combining studies in the Marxist tradition with exploration of current struggles and recent political history. This approach gained new importance in the wake of last summer's Black Lives Matter uprising against police violence and killings. We're excited that these readings and our discussions together will help all of us to better understand some essential features of global capitalism: war, slavery, finance, and empire, to use David's subtitle. David McNally is a longtime activist and scholar. At present, he's Distinguished Professor of History and Business at the University of Houston, and previously taught political science for many years at York University in Toronto. He's the author of many articles and books, including the Deutscher Prize-winning Monsters of the Market and Global Slump, which received the 2012 Paul Sweezy Award. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to our guest, David McNally.
Thank you so much, Fred, and thank you to Steve as well for organizing this session today, to Michael, who reached out to me earlier also, but most importantly also thank you to everybody who's taking the time to, in certain sense, explore with me what I said, and I mean that seriously, because when you're writing away on your own, you don't really know which lines of argument and analysis are going to most connect with readers. And so in a certain sense, readers start to reinterpret for you, challenge and explore with you what you were up to. So what I thought I would do, given the focus of your reading group, is just give you a few preliminary remarks about the overall project of Blood and Money, and then connect it to some of the themes you're going to be exploring. That is to say, the return of the concept of racial capitalism to a much more central position in both scholarly circles and activist circles on the left, and then talk a little bit about what I might call the research agenda of racial capitalism as a concept right now, because every rediscovery is also a moment where horizons are extended, where thinking is deepened in certain areas. And so this moment of discovery and reflection on the concept of racial capitalism is going to go beyond previous ones. It's going to push all of it in new directions and so on. So with that in mind, let me start really at the nexus of blood, money, and racial capitalism, and say to you that this book began with the sense that I think Marx has in Capital, that there are mysteries to be solved, that capitalism presents itself in a mysterious guise. After all, it appears as the society of freedom, and yet all around us we see and experience modes of coercion, bondage, and unfreedom. It presents itself as the society of human equality, and yet we see the most grotesque forms of inequality in human history. And a large part of Marx's work in Capital is really oriented to a kind of detective work tracing of clues in order to decipher what's happening beneath the surface. There are things that don't appear on the surface that are going on. And this is a motif that runs through his writings about capitalism. And interestingly, in one of the recent books published on the topic of racial capitalism, Gargi Bhattacharya writes, and this is one of the few quotes I'll give you. I will share one or two other quotes, but she says, simple one sentence, quote, "The answers to the mystery of racial capitalism must lie in the mystery of capital itself." And there's a sense in which Blood and Money shares that spirit, that we're engaged in a work of detection, of deciphering clues, and that this work takes us across a landscape of violence and suffering. It's a very important part of the analysis, that we're dealing with a political economy of life and death. And some of you familiar with the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore will already detect certain resonances with her analysis of racism. At the same time, of course, this terrain of a political economy of life and death is also one of oppositional currents. It features struggles by those who are resisting violence and domination and pointing us to a world beyond racial capitalism. That context connected with a broader set of concerns I had at the time when I wrote the book. And I think you'll see why they're pertinent to all of the kinds of discussions that you're having. Because I was also interested, as part of this project of demystifying, of getting beyond the surface appearances of things, to offer a distinctive account of the origins of money. Because there's a sense in which what we're doing when we engage in this kind of Marxist critical work is we are rehistoricizing things. Marx tells us over and over again that part of the ideological formation of capitalism is that very historical sets of social relationships become naturalized. It appears as if they originate in the natural world, not that they're historically specific and unique, and therefore they might come to an end because they had a beginning. They're not simply rooted in nature. And this really means debunking the claims that, as Adam Smith would have it, an inherent propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another is the origin of capitalism. For Adam Smith, capitalism has its roots in our human natural desire to trade. And that's why Marx goes after Adam Smith right at the beginning of the final section, part 8 of Capital, on the so-called primitive accumulation of capital. Marx wants to historicize what appears to have been naturalized, to tell us that capitalism is a product of history. And really, in turning to the history of money, I wanted to challenge the fable of the market that we get from Adam Smith and mainstream economics, that money emerges organically from benign practices of mutually beneficial trade. I wanted to get beyond that and to argue, to demonstrate that money foundationally is a technology of power and domination. And as a result, I went to the origins of full-fledged money in the ancient Mediterranean world and tried to show that the emergence and development of money are inseparable from warfare and from slave trading. that money did not emerge because people found it a more convenient way to trade wine for textiles. Money emerged as an instrument overwhelmingly for the purchase of human beings and for the organization of violence, that is, the making of war by states. And that's the sense in which I think the book is really trying to observe Marx's famous dictum, where he says that capital comes into the world dripping in blood and dirt. That's from part 8 on primitive accumulation, to say yes. And in fact, there are earlier histories of money rooted in blood and dirt that we need to excavate, that we need to explore, that we need to bring back into our historical understanding. And so a central claim of the book is that there are 3 modular forms of money historically. I'm not going to spend any time on this right now, except to say a little bit about the US case in a moment. But the claims are, as you can see, that the ancient form of money was coinage. It was money based on precious metal. It emerged, as I say, in the ancient Mediterranean world. And coinage was the predominant form for really a couple of millennia, at least. And then, with the initial rise of capitalism, a second form was created around the Bank of England, where paper money circulated by and through a symbiosis of private financiers and the state began to circulate, known as notes from the Bank of England, which, by the way, the Bank of England was a private institution. It was a private bank that contracted with the state to sell its debt. And so money based on paper certificates tied to debt of the Bank of England, but still connected to precious metal, circulated. And this enabled an enormous expansion through violence, through warfare, and through slave trading of English capitalism. English capitalism came to dominate the world after the creation of the Bank of England in 1694, in part because it had new technologies of war finance, imperial finance, and slave trading. And I argue that that modality of money held for nearly 300 years until, interestingly, in the midst of a crisis of war finance at the end of the 1960s and beginning of the 1970s, the American government under Richard Nixon did something unprecedented. They broke the legal convertibility of paper money for gold. And they created a purely paper money form of the US dollar from 1971 on. And I take you through the ins and outs of that in the book. But I argue that this has become a new and incredibly dynamic form of imperial money, but also one that invariably produces repeated financial crises. That the global financial crises that we've been dealing with, particularly since the crash of 2008-9, represent some of the inherent contradictions of that new form. So as you can see, I'm tying the history of money to warfare and to the slave trade and to projects of empire. Now, a couple of comments about US history in monetary terms, and then I'll come directly to the issue of racial capitalism. Because I don't get to this till chapter 5 of the book, and I hope that won't disappoint some of you as readers. I hope you'll see the point of trying to reconstruct some of the history first. But one of the things I'm at pains to point out is that banking and financial history in the US in the early stages looks utterly chaotic. Prior to the Civil War, there were 7,000 different banknotes in circulation in the US, coming out of almost 2,000 different banks. Every bank could produce its own banknotes because there was no central bank in the US. So the system looks utterly chaotic. But I try to show that, in fact, if you look at two of the most important original forms of money, of currency in the US, it tells us a huge amount about settler capitalism and racial capitalism. Because two of the most important of these forms were tobacco money, created in Virginia in the 1640s, which endured for about 200 years, and land bank money, which interestingly Benjamin Franklin called coined land, because the money, the asset underlying the paper money was land, and it emerged in South Carolina in 1712. And it was replicated by 8 other American colonies at the time. Now, why do I point to tobacco money and land money? Because tobacco was a product of slave labor. It was paper notes circulated whose underlying asset was the product of slave labor. And land bank money was money circulated based on land stolen from indigenous peoples. In other words, in each case, the asset that underpinned these two forms of money, tobacco money and land bank money, take us back to the mysteries of racial capitalism. Its settler colonial form with respect to indigenous peoples, and its racial form in the labor of enslaved Africans brought to the New World. And so I try to show that this is foundational to the development of finance, banking, and capitalism in the US. Okay, with that backdrop, which I hope gives you some sense of what the book tries to do, let me come now to some of the questions that I think are going to interest you as you move forward with the discussions, not only of my book, but of a number of deliberations on racial capitalism and commerce and capitalism, empire, and so on. One of these questions comes pretty directly out of discussions related to Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism. And that has to do with the issue as to whether racism and dispossession are predecessors of European capitalism, i.e., social relations that were pretty much already constructed and upon which European capitalism built. In other words, there's one line of argument in Robinson, it seems, in which racism and forms of racial domination and dispossession were already there in European societies before the rise of capitalism and facilitated the rise of capitalism. Some commentators worry that this produces an overly static notion in which there's simply an inheritance, a racial inheritance that capitalism takes over, and that it is a largely unchanging form. However, there's another line of argument in other writings by Robinson where he talks about racial regimes. And that's a much more historical notion because he recognizes that the racial regimes within capitalism shift and change. So you might have a racial regime, for instance, in which chattel slavery figures significantly, and you might have other racial regimes without chattel slavery. And that seems to me is a really interesting line of analysis, and it fits with some of the work that's been done, especially since the 1980s in the US, on racial formation, which looks at racial formation or race making as a very dynamic, volatile, changing set of relationships. And that discussion sometimes opens up a different set of possibilities. So I'm going to give you just a very brief passage, again, just a sentence, actually not even a full sentence, from a recent paper by Arun Kundnani. And Kundnani, who is talking about the name of the paper, by the way, is simply What is Racial Capitalism? And Kundnani says to us, talking about the picture that we get from Cedric Robinson, it seems to me that there is a tension between the picture of racism as constantly regenerated through changing relations of production. That's the racial formation, racial regimes approach. And he continues, and the picture of racism as exceeding its imbrication with relations of production and ultimately residing in a separate history. And so the tension that Kundnani is looking at is really between the idea that racism has its own distinct history prior to capitalism. And I can see there's a request to put it in the chat, which I will try to do. But let me just say that if you Google what is racial capitalism, it should come up because it's a text from a talk that he gave late last year, I think. But I'll try to get it into the chat later for sure. Somebody's already posted it. Thank you very much. So that tension between race having a separate history and what he calls the picture of racism as constantly regenerated through changing relations of production, I think it's one of the most fruitful and important research questions right now for all of us around racial capitalism. Related to that is a question that almost everybody writing in the area is really interested in, and it's got to do with the inherent processes of differentiation among laborers that capitalism creates. This is really the issue that we sometimes now call the production of difference. There was a stream of thinking within the left that believed that Marx's account of capitalism required a notion of the working classes becoming more and more homogeneous. People's conditions of work, wages, and so on becoming more and more similar. Now, I don't think that's accurate, an accurate reading of Marx, but there has been really good work both in political economy and in the study of racial formation that has really tried to emphasize that capital accumulation differentiates, produces difference. And there's a beautiful, this time I'm going to give you two-sentence formulation from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, in The Futures of Black Radicalism on this. For those of you who want to look it up, it's the very last part of Ruthie's discussion in that volume on Futures of Black Radicalism. Comes on page 240, last paragraph, where she says, the racial and racial capitalism isn't secondary, nor did it originate in color or intercontinental conflict, but rather always group differentiation to premature death. And then the key, the kind of zinger sentence, capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. Okay, so Ruth Wilson Gilmore's focus here is on saying to us that capitalism inherently differentiates within the working class. Some sections of the laboring class are more vulnerable to premature death, which is essential to her definition of racial domination. And racism is the social and ideological formation that enshrines group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So you can see here the way in which Ruth Wilson Gilmore is really tying racial formation to the dynamics both of accumulation and differentiation. And so she believes, as she demonstrates in her book, Golden Gulag, that we need to be very attentive to the social, historical, and geographic, the spatial formations in which all of this happens. So I touch on that because this is also connected to really fascinating discussions which have been going on for the last 20 years or so in particular around primitive accumulation and the violence of accumulation, with essentially one school within Marxism essentially saying that violent dispossession is a formative phase of capitalism. And the other school saying, yes, but capitalism originates out of this kind of original violence that Marx describes as primitive accumulation. But it also reorganizes and reproduces violent processes of dispossession across its history. And therefore, differentiation, or if you want, differentiated dispossession, some people are more dispossessed, more violently dispossessed than others across the circuits of capital. This becomes a story of the continual making and remaking of race in the terms in which Ruth Wilson Gilmore has given it to us. That as capitalism constantly reorganizes its labor markets, its working class, its subalterns, it reorganizes the ways in which they are racially differentiated. So I say all of that not because I'm trying to give you the final word. On the contrary, I think we're in a really challenging, but also exciting intellectually and politically, exciting moment in the work that's being done on global dispossession, race making, and capitalist accumulation. And I hope that Blood and Money opens up certain lines of investigation there and is helpful in certain respects, but I have no illusions that it's the last word. In fact, I hope I haven't said my last word on the topic, and I hope that what you're doing through the Marxist Education Project will be part of that collective practice of deepening our thinking and developing it in all kinds of new and interesting ways. So let me stop there. I really look forward to any of the questions, comments that you folks would like to raise.